The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I'm Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today's training is part of our racial equity series, is entitled The Architecture of Racial Injustice and Historical Analysis. It is my privilege to introduce, It is my privilege to introduce today's first presenter, Donald Whitehead. Donald, take it away.
Good afternoon. I'm Donald Whitehead. I am with Racial Equity Partners. I am one of the co-founders. Our organization was founded with Jeff Olivet. I almost called him Joe. He won't like that. Jeff is now the interagency, the U.S. Interagency Council Executive Director, but he helped found our group, and we have done some work on this particular set of protections before. Today, I'll be presenting with Sarah Breyer, and she will certainly introduce herself, but just a little bit about my background. I've been working on homeless issues for the better part of 28 years and have worked at all levels of service delivery, from outreach to executive director positions. But throughout that time, I've worked on the issue of racial equity. I started writing about it in the late 1990s and have been doing work on the issue since then. I've been a board member for the Georgetown Center on Cultural Competency, and also a board member and executive director and president of the National Coalition for the Homeless. So I look forward to being with you today. And with that, I'll pass it to Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be with you today. I'm Sarah Breyer, she, her pronouns. I'm a race equity consultant that works in the space of organizational development and policy analysis. I come to the work with 30 some years of experience doing criminal legal transformation, the last 15 of which or so were as the executive director of an advocacy organization working to transform our youth justice laws on the state level. And I am pleased to be associated with Racial Equity Partners and to be with you in the room today to talk about racial injustice. I'll toss it back to Donald.
So thank you very much. And again, we welcome all of you to today's presentation. We're going to cover a lot of ground today, about 600 years, if you will. So please bear with us. That amount of history takes quite a bit of time, and we could do 2 or 3 weeks on this issue, but we'll do our best to frame it in a way that really gives you some new understanding of the issues. Now, we will be actually doing a number of other workshops that are racial equity based workshops. Today's session, again, is the Architecture of Racial Injustice, a historical analysis of the issue. We'll get into institutional transformation, how you can become an anti-racist organization. We'll talk through your personal journey of understanding racial identity, making change, how you can use your own personal spheres of influence, the impact of race and understanding internalized racism, allyship and activism, becoming an anti-racist practice, leading with racial equity, the impacts of implicit bias in the workspace, and finally, cultural humility. So we hope that you will stay with us through the entire series. We think everyone listening will greatly benefit from it. So we look forward to working with you. And so today we'll also be providing a series of handouts and resources so that you can do your own study. We believe that in order to really fully embrace and understand the issues around racial equity, it is very important that you become your own historian. So we're going to provide you some resources to help you along the way towards that goal. So please look out for these resources after today's presentation. So we want you to follow what was created in the education space by Mr. Singleton, who also worked with a couple of other people And these are courageous conversations about race. And just really four things we want you to remember as we go through today's presentation. And the first of those is to expect to experience discomfort. Conversations about race and racism are difficult. These are muscles we built by practicing and continuing to work at it. So expect to experience some discomfort, but please stay with us even though that may happen. We ask you to speak your truth when we're in conversation. We will have a couple of times where we want to hear from you about the session. So we expect to hear your truth. So we're not asking you to advocate or speak on behalf of your race or ethnicity or any other group. So the truth you speak is your own truth. And you'll use terms like I and my as opposed to our and we, so that we're hearing your truth. We ask that you stay engaged, be present, resist multitasking. Active listening is really important. And assume good intent, appreciating that everyone has good intentions and also biases. And finally, expect and accept non-closure. Now, we won't be able to really fully close the door on racism in America in this session or all of the sessions that we present. So please expect that you will experience some non-closure. This has been an issue in our country for centuries, but today's training hopefully moves you down that path in the direction towards resolution and understanding of the issue, but we will not get there, so expect that. So those are our four rules of conversation. So we start off with the question, why here, why now? Why have you seen so much discourse about the issue of racism in America, in the workplace and in the media and in readings? You've seen more and more about these issues and why. How do we get here? So I just want to take us back a little bit in time, a very short journey back to what happened in our country over the last few years. We start off with a picture of Ahmaud Arbery. Ahmaud Arbery was killed in Georgia. The perpetrators of his crime were actually found guilty, but these were people who practiced vigilantism. They chased down this young African-American man and executed him. Simply because they thought he might have been committing a crime, which was later found to not be true. And then we also have Breonna Taylor, who was a victim of a no-knock warrant for someone else, and her life was taken away, and no one has assumed any responsibility for this. The picture in your lower left-hand corner is a picture of children in cages, and it's a depiction of our immigration, our failed immigration policies. And we heard much more conversation about that after we found out that young people were not only being separated from their families, but they were being held in cages. And just yesterday, we saw the dire consequences of a failed immigration policy. We saw over 50 people die in the back of the truck in Texas because of their need to try to get to this country faced with really horrible immigration policies. The picture in the middle is a picture of Amy Cooper in, excuse me, in Central Park in New York. And Amy is a person who engaged in a practice that we saw quite a bit over the last 2 years. She made a false report, a false assumption about a person of color, and put their life in danger by making that report to law enforcement. She basically encountered a bird watcher in the park. His name actually was Mr. Cooper as well. And she reported to the law enforcement officials that this individual was a danger, that he had threatened her, and he was simply asking her to put a leash on her dog. And we've seen the negative impact of what has happened when those kinds of reports are made, and there is an encounter between law enforcement and people of color. And finally, kind of the epitome of field policy, the intersection of all of the things we're going to talk about actually culminated in what happened during COVID-19. We saw a dramatic overrepresentation of people of color in those that died from the disease and those that contracted, especially people of color. Native Americans and African Americans were negatively impacted in dramatic ways when it comes to this disease. And what you hear us talk about today directly impacted that situation. So these are things that really have brought us to an inflection point, and we've had many of those over the course of our history, but this was a culmination very similar to things like Emmett Till's murder that made us really sort of reckon with race in this country. And that's why we're talking about it today. That's why people are talking about it in other spaces. So thank you for that. And then we're going to talk about structural racism. And if there is an example of structural racism, how it develops, its impact, it was the murder of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer. And the structural connection to this particular case is that over years and years of practice, we found that the police department in Minnesota has had negative interactions, disproportionately violent with people of color. And that police department, even as of a couple of months ago, was found to be a police department that structurally practiced inordinate treatment and treatment that was non-equal to people of color. Now, the officer that perpetrated the crime against George Floyd actually was a member of the police force, and this is how institutional racism is exhibited. So this particular police officer in his department, although he had been found in violation of policies and had been found to have racist practices and been charged with that 18 different times, this institution perpetrated the structural racism by making him a trainer. So this particular officer was actually training other officers. He was actually training an officer when George Floyd was killed. And his individual racism, which is the third level we'll talk about, caused him to keep his knee on George Floyd's neck until all the breath left his body. So that is a perfect example of how structures, institutions, and individuals perpetrate and prolong racism in our country. A few more pictures just to, again, talk about historical implications and how they land today. So we have heard a lot in the media about Asian hate crimes. What you'll find in our historical analysis is that this is not a new phenomenon. The violence, the racism, the unequal treatment of Asian Americans and Asians from other countries has been a part of our history for a long time. You have Judge Brown, Ketanji Brown, who was just appointed today to the Supreme Court, and some of the vicious attacks that she encountered in our country's history. She is absolutely the first African-American woman to become a Supreme Court judge. And why is that? After years and years of what we thought was equality. And finally, January 6th, which was an ugly stain on our country. We're hearing a lot about it now. This particular incident is very reminiscent of incidents that happened earlier in our history after Reconstruction. So we'll talk about that connection a little bit. So these slides really show that we've come a long way as far as history goes, but not as far as when it comes to the issue of racism and structural racism in our country. And finally, what we see, and while we're here, is people have said enough is enough. So the federal government for the first time has said enough is enough. People marched in the streets, Black Lives Matter. We see other people marching on Asian right issues, LGBTQ issues. So there's some intersectionality there, but people have been fed up with conditions. And now we're seeing the other side of being fed up, and that's people getting out in the streets and talking about it. And again, we're going to be talking today from the perspective of 3 levels of racism. The structural level, and that's decisions intentionally made by bodies of government and larger institutional forces that perpetuate racism and actually create policies that benefit one group of people over another. Usually it's white people over people of color. The structural racism is intentional. It's not something that happens by mistake. And in order for it to continue, the institutions have to be a part of making sure that that chain of racism continues. And then lastly, the interpersonal. Now, the interpersonal is where people get stuck. And today we'll be talking about historical racism. We're not talking about anybody on this call being a racist. Interpersonal racism is sometimes it's intentional. It's the Proud Boys, it's the Ku Klux Klan, it's groups like that. That's interpersonal racism. But there's also racism that is unintentional, that is created by biases that we all have. So we'll be talking through all of that today. Thank you very much for that introduction in the beginning. And we'll go to our next slide. And I believe at this point, we're going to turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Donald. So we're going to give you a bit of a whirlwind tour of racial injustice throughout our history. And we like to start big picture because we feel that unless we really understand our history, we cannot really fully understand the problems with our policies, and we can't fix those policies. We can't make change unless we understand where we came from. So we're going to give a really kind of whirlwind tour of the last 500 years. And there's lots of, as Donald said in the beginning, we're going to give you a lot of resources that you can go if you want to dig deeper into any of these particular issues. There's certainly lots written. There's many books, there's websites, there's lots to explore. This is a well-known quote by George Santayana. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We know that if we blind ourselves to our own reality, we are unable to see the problems, we're unable to make change. The problem is that we don't often know our history. And one of the things that we see, and we call this the whitewashing of history. Our history books have sugarcoated a lot of our history. And this is really at the root of our trying to teach accurate history to children in schools. There's this fear that once we put the truth out there, that it can't be unseen. It's just too painful. So there's a number of ways that we don't teach history, that we remove history, the real history. We rewrite it, we dishonor it, we erase it. So if we look at this picture of the early, of the colonists with Native people, this is a false mythology, that there was a mutually friendly, a mutual aid that was going on between the colonists and the Native Americans. Of course, this was utterly false on every front. People in my generation, this is the narrative that I grew up with. This is what I learned in grammar school and in middle school. But the whitewashing can also be more subtle. We see on the right a picture of Martin Luther King. This is the statue that was recently erected on the National Mall. And folks might remember that there was a concern about the quote that was etched into the statue. And the quote that was originally etched was, "I was a drum major for justice, peace, and righteousness." In fact, what Martin Luther King was trying to say was that we come to this work sometimes with ambitions, and it's okay to be ambitious in the work if we use those ambitions towards a greater end. The full quote is, yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major for justice, say I was a drum major for justice, and all of the other shallow things will not matter. He was making a larger point that basically got erased. It ultimately got put back in, which is good. There's also just straight up erasing of history. The truth can be so painful, particularly for white people who largely control the narrative. So after the Civil War ended, folks from the Smithsonian went out to interview formerly enslaved people. These were some of the earliest organized efforts to capture the experience of slavery by the US government. But the stories that the formerly enslaved people told were so horrific and barbaric that the authors edited them so they were more palatable for white audiences. So again, like here's this wonderful chance to actually have enshrined in US government archives these narratives, and the white people chose to erase it. We're going to explore several themes related to our history. You'll see these themes repeated through the centuries. So there's theft of labor and land, the general lack of agency over one's own life, dehumanization through enslavement, inhumane treatment, cultural appropriation, cultural erasure, family separation, genocide, the splitting of oppressed people, pitting them against each other as a way to entrench power, and the creation of whiteness and the assignment of privileges to the white class. So our incredibly wealthy nation was built on theft of native lands and with chattel slavery as the engine of economic development. Unless you're a native person yourself, you're standing on stolen land, and we have to keep acknowledging this. This is a great resource out of Canada, actually. If you go to native-land.ca, you can punch in your home address or your work address and see what tribal nations were living there initially, what indigenous people were there. It's really important to note that prior to 1491, the time of the first contact with Europeans, tribal societies throughout the Americas and surrounding nations were flourishing. Many of them had developed sophisticated agricultural, navigational, medicinal, and technological advances that we continue to use and learn from to this day. We can't tell the full story of what we did to Native peoples, but throughout the course of the next 20 minutes or so, we'll give you a snapshot of some of the more egregious and illustrative moments. So of course, 1492, Christopher Columbus makes landfall in the Caribbean islands. He's in search of gold and slaves. He writes in his journal in 1492 that the native people he encounters can be easily subjugated. And his next voyage was focused on capturing native people and for the slave trade. These inhumane goals of Columbus were actually shortly thereafter subsequently authorized by the church. So the Pope issues a decree in 1493 that, quote, any lands inhabited by people who are not Christians can be discovered by Christians who would then have the authority to overthrow those, quote, barbarous nations. So this sets the stage. From the beginning, the treatment of Native peoples was brutal. There was enslavement, there was biological warfare by giving them smallpox blankets, the blankets infused with the smallpox virus, land theft, family separation, and rape. This is a map we often think of the colonists as coming from Britain, but the Spanish were making an immense incursions into North America from South America. You had sort of the British colonists coming in from the east, but there was also tremendous Spanish colonization coming up from the south. The estimates of the native population around 1500 was between 1 to 18 million people. And by 1990, that had been reduced by 70 to 90%. This is just full on genocide, and we have to acknowledge it as such. (1619). So in 1619, we have 20 people are stolen from their homes in West Africa and brought to the English settlement at Jamestown, marking the beginning of a transatlantic slave trade that would bring millions more from their homes and families to the land that was being colonized by the British. By 1661, slavery is legal in 9 colonies. Eventually, it's legal in all 13 that became the United States. Virginia later declares that, quote, Indians, mulattoes, and Negroes are to be real estate, end quote. And in 1682, New York forbids African or Native American enslaved people from leaving their masters' homes or plantations without permission. Slavery is well on its way to becoming the economic engine of the colonies. Very early on, the colonists realized that they had to contend with the potential for powerful insurrections if the white indentured servants banded together with the Black servants. So we see the beginning of laws and practices that give the white servants a slightly more elevated status and consequently more hope, and thus a reason not to be identified with their Black compatriots. So for instance, in 1640, 3 servants run away from Virginia to Maryland. 2 are white and 1 is Black. They're captured and returned. They all receive 30 lashes. The white men are sentenced to 4 more years of additional servitude, while the black man, John Punch, is ordered to serve his master for the rest of his life. In 1667 is another example. We have Bacon's Rebellion. So this is an armed rebellion against the colonial governor because he was perceived as being too lenient towards the native populations. The rebellion was led by Nathaniel Bacon and created an alliance between European indentured servants and black people who were servants, enslaved, and free. The rebellion failed, but it resulted ultimately in the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705, which hardened the racial caste system as the colonists tried to prevent future unified actions by assigning more privileges to white people and further subjugating the enslaved people. For instance, they said that white people could not be employed by black people. They established separate courts for black and white people, and the slave trade was given protection by the courts. By the 1780s, we start seeing poorhouses being created. The first one is in New York City. Boston and Philadelphia soon follow. None of these allowed people of color to stay there. This carries forward a tradition that is still in effect today, in which white people get entitlements to support and resources, while people of color do not. This is an ongoing theme in our country, in which we have endless examples of white entitlements and white affirmative action, which remain hidden and obscured by racist rhetoric around people of color seeking handouts and being undeserving. This is a picture of a slave coffle. You see enslaved people being shackled, walking in front of our nation's capital, which is of course built by enslaved people. It's really easy to paint the portrait that racism and slavery was a Southern problem and is a Southern problem, and it's just not true. Prior to the mid-19th century, the highest concentration of enslaved people was in New York City. It wasn't until well into the 1800s that that changed. So now slavery becomes the economic engine in the United States. The cotton gin is invented in the 1790s. By the way, some have argued that an enslaved person actually first came up with the idea for the cotton gin. It's in full use by the 1800s. It makes growing cotton much more profitable. Cotton still needs to be picked by hand, but the separation of the fibers from the seeds happens much more quickly, and this drives the need for more enslaved people. The number of enslaved people rose with the increase in cotton production from 700,000 in 1790 to over 3 million by 1850. It's important to remember that this is a full-on economic system. This is not something that just happened in the South. We had Northern bankers financing the insurance on the enslaved people because, of course, they were property of the white slaveholders. Northern industrialists built cotton mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, and upstate New York, reaping the benefits of cotton picked by enslaved people. And this economic symbiotic relationship between Northern financiers, Southern slaveholders, and Northern industrialists was really deeply entrenched and fully incestuous. And our government, of course, is being run by men who are fully engaged in this economic structure. 12 of our first 16 presidents owned human beings. 1,700 elected representatives and legislators were slaveholders. The laws that were being written were written by folks who owned people for the benefit of others who owned people. So one of the things that the cotton gin did was the expansion of cotton as an economic engine was it made colonists hungry for more land to plant cotton. And yet another action of white entitlement and affirmative action, we have the mass removal of Native people from their lands in order to facilitate the apportionment of their lands to white farmers. So President Andrew Jackson, whose portrait, of course, some might recall, hung in former President Donald Trump's Oval Office, signs the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Over the next few years, the US military rounded up and marched across territories hundreds of thousands of Native people, displacing Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and other Native people. Along the way, they suffered from deadly disease, starvation, exhaustion. Families were torn apart. Children were ripped from their parents' arms. It was truly a trail of tears. You can see that they are being relocated in this map to something called Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. This is the first major federal legislation that creates mass homelessness. As a quick follow-up, two quick follow-ups to this Indian Removal Act. One, just to drive home the fact that this was stolen land, in 1837, Congress prohibits direct payment to tribes for ceded lands. And to make clear that the land theft and the theft of land autonomy continues to this day, we have the recent Supreme Court decision in which the justices said that the state, Oklahoma, can abrogate tribal sovereignty to prosecute non-native people who commit crimes on native land. Continuing our story of land theft, this is the maps of the Mexican-American War. We can see the outline of the United States before in 1846 and what it looked like after in 1848. We signed a treaty in 1848, which transferred over 55% of Mexican land to the United States, which is now present-day Arizona, California, New Mexico, Texas, and parts of Colorado. The treaty we signed said we would protect the land, language, and culture of Mexicans living in the ceded territory. But Congress then says that it requires Mexicans to prove in court that they have legitimate title to their lands. Not surprisingly, they were unable to provide proof in a culture that did not record land transactions. This then becomes the legal basis for the massive theft of land from the Mexicans living in these territories. Really important to note that it wasn't just theft of land. There was incredible violence against the Mexicans living on these lands. There was lynchings, killings, really direct assaults to try to remove the Mexicans from the land so the white people could take it over. And the 13th Amendment. So we all know the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery. However, it abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime. So this led to the imposition of vagrancy laws in which Black people could be arrested for being unemployed. And these laws basically created a new form of enslavement, convict leasing, in which people in prison are leased out by the sheriff to their former slaveholders to work on the farms from which they had just been freed, which, although hard to imagine, was even more brutal than slavery, as no one had an economic interest in the well-being of the people in prison. And finally, these vagrancy laws were basically a part of the new Black codes that came out right after the passage of the 13th Amendment. And they were enacted in southern states to restrict the rights of Black people to own property, to conduct business, lease land, and move freely through public spaces. I'm going to thank you for answering the poll. Anybody else wants to chime in? And I'm going to turn it over to Donald.
Well, the poll is
Thank
just up. We have 13% of respondents. Let's give it a minute, Donald, before we move forward.
Absolutely.
Where can I find the poll?
The poll should actually be on your screen, correct?
It was for a minute, and then when I scrolled to answer it, it disappeared.
Okay.
Oh, there it is. Thank you.
Should we, I think the results are being shared in real time. Folks can see. Is that right?
It looks like 82% of the people that responded said yes, that the previous slides changed their understanding of American history. That's a very high percentage. We got about 57% of the people on the call to respond. So I think that is really reflective of our need to continue to make sure that we do this kind of work to get that information out. So thank you for participating. We'll jump into the next part of our discussion today. So we want to pick up a little bit after slavery was ended with the 13th Amendment, and also what isn't as widely, I think, understood about the following amendments is that African Americans were actually given a right to vote at that time. But there were a few. The 15th Amendment prohibited states from disenfranchising voters on account of their race or previous condition. But it did leave open the possibility that states could institute voter qualifications. So for the next really long period in our history, African Americans and immigrants did not participate in the voting process because there were things like poll taxes and there were all these other literacy tests and there were all these things that even though the right to vote was there, and this is a group of actually elected officials. I believe this is in this was the 41st and 42nd Congress of the United States. There were African Americans elected in many communities, but there was a lot of backlash, and the former slave owners and Confederate officers did not want to create a majority of people of color. And so there was a lot of backlash that resulted in really, really horrific violence. There were riots, there were all kinds of things that were instituted to prevent people from voting. And in the beginning, when I talked about January 6th, there's examples of the same kind of assault on federal courthouses and federal buildings as a result of people trying to eliminate the results of voting. This was back in the 1860s, so history repeats itself again. So we'll go to the next slide to talk about the place in our history where we could have changed things, but during that time right after slavery, there were also incidents that really underscored just the really kind of I think very, very unfortunate idea of using race as a way to separate people. Because we know that if you think about white skin, there are people from other parts of the world whose skin's a lot whiter than the people who are here in America. And even back then, so we'll keep going. I'm gonna speed it up a little bit. So there were a couple of cases where people were tested by the color of their skin, and these cases went to the Supreme Court, where people wanted to be considered white people because of their advantage, even though they had come from other parts of the world. But they were ruled against in the Azawa case, sorry, versus the United States. It was ruled that these immigrants from the Middle East were still not considered white in America. So that is another case where people their place in American society changed. And we won't talk as much about colorism here, but that is another issue that we still face in America. So we'll go to the next slide. And this just depicts the situations of other immigrants in this country. At one time, almost all people who immigrated into this country were considered less than. So whether it was Irish immigrants or Asian immigrants and Latinx, Hispanic immigrants, they were all considered less than. And these are some images of people from Eastern and Southern Europe being othered, being treated very poorly when they arrived in the United States. There's a picture there of Mexico, people from Mexico working in the field in Chicago. And then there's also the people who are in pictures around building the Transcontinental Railroad. And what we'll see later, and this is a picture that depicts the 1880s to 1920s. And so our next slide goes back to what we talked about earlier when we were talking about Asian hate. In 1882, the president signed the Asian Exclusion Act. that even though some of those immigrants from China helped us build that intercontinental railroad, they were actually excluded from immigrating to the country at one point because of prejudice and racism against them by the federal government. Again, another example of an intentional decision that caused discrimination against people of a certain race in this country. The next picture is of another time in our country. And again, these decisions were not made by any specific party in power in our country. There were both Republican and Democrats. And one thing that people find very kind of confusing about this issue is that Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and the Republican Party was more aligned with people of color back in that part of our history. And then the whole idea of political parties switched. And now we have a system where Democrats are more aligned with people of color versus Republicans. And so when people talk about Abraham Lincoln and his Republican background, that's absolutely true. The next picture is of the 1940s, and that was the Japanese internment camps. Again, in the 30s, we started to see the development of housing programs. We saw housing being developed for military returnees. We saw housing being developed for people who were suffering during the Depression. Most of those programs were, again, white-only programs. So people of color were not able to benefit from some of the programs that were being created. Even public housing created in the 1930s was segregated. Public housing even segregated already integrated communities. So there was white public housing and Black public housing. The white public housing was really close to jobs that were created through the jobs programs in the New Deal. And those were very close, and those that were for people of color and immigrants were a lot farther away, so less access to the jobs, something we still see in our country today. So the next slide moves us to the Great Migration. So the Reconstruction period in our country lasted from 1865, after the Emancipation Proclamation, to 1877. During that period, we had the opportunity to level the playing field. The idea was actually a good idea to do that. The Reconstruction was to give people property, give people the chance to support themselves. But there was a backlash from former slave owners and people in the Confederacy. And in order to keep the country together, there was a compromise. And so what should have been a very substantial leveling of the playing field actually failed. One of the things that kept it together, and we'll go to the next slide, was that there was protection for people that were in former slave states by the federal government. Union soldiers helped keep the peace in those communities, helped to make sure that the level of violence was kept to a minimum. Actually, Rutherford B. Hayes, in a compromise, again, made the decision to pull troops out of the South. And it really opened the doors to one of the most horrific periods in our lives. So groups like the Ku Klux Klan, and they have been called many names. There was a lot of other groups that were perpetrating all kinds of violence against people of color. We know thousands of people were lynched, people were beaten, people were put back into indentured slavery, and they changed the name. They called it sharecropping. One thing that historians like to talk about is that although slavery ended, racism got stronger. And so what happened is, because of all of that, and because of the promise of higher wages in the North, 6 million African Americans left the South and moved north. And they moved with the hopes that they would have the opportunity to experience the finer things in life, that they would receive equality, that people would welcome them with open arms. But what happened on the next slide is that that's not what they encountered when they got here. So in the West, in the Midwest, in the East, wherever people migrated to, they ran into some of the same things. So what you see here are pictures of signs that were actually in place in communities. So a lot of what happened were restricted covenants. And these covenants said that you as a homeowner could not sell your property to a African-American or an immigrant, and that you had to sell that to a white person. And these covenants were in place from 1920 to 1948. Some were in place before that, but the period that is most documented is 1920 to 1948. And finally, restricted covenants were outlawed in 1948, but the practice continued long after that. And some would say still continues today. And one of the most egregious and probably highly recognized forms of discrimination was in redlining. And if you read Richard Rothstein's book on this, he talks about California in the very beginning of his explanation of redlining. And so in a nutshell, redlining was really practiced by the federal government. So the federal government made a decision, and they those responsible for home loans and responsible for mortgages colluded with the banks and with realtors, and they put guardrails around communities to make sure that people of color and immigrants didn't move to what they thought were the most desirable communities. There was this myth that was perpetrated then that said that people of color would cause the property values to go down. You probably hear that today, that property values, they would create danger in these communities. So realtors were not able to sell properties in the communities that were color coded in this map in red. The other thing that it did is it created the ghettos and the really harmful and unhealthy communities that we see in some parts of our country today, because people were compacted. One thing you'll notice about this map, and this is a map of Boston, there's also one of Austin, comparatively, the redlined communities are very small, which means that because there were fewer choices for places for people to live, they were compacted into these communities. It was overcrowded. It was unhealthy because in addition to not having the space, not having the quality housing, the housing in those communities couldn't be insured. And it also prevented jobs and healthcare and food establishments from entering those companies. Entering those communities, they could not invest in those communities because it wasn't a winning proposition. So we talked about another connection. You talk about COVID. Because these communities still exist in many parts of our country, COVID was more prevalent in those communities because they didn't have the resources. They didn't have jobs in the communities. They didn't have healthcare facilities. They don't have adequate housing or jobs. So all of those things combined put people at greater risk of COVID. So we see that these practices were not only draconian practices back then, they're still in place right now. And so we know on the next slide that the effects of these policies are long-term. 1968, we got the Fair Housing Act. I would argue that it didn't change very much and it hasn't been enforced very well even since then. And even today, we still need some help with enforcing it. But, you know, laws did pass. We had the Civil Rights Act. We had the Voting Rights Act, which took away some of those practices that prevented people from voting. And we had the Fair Housing Act. So the civil rights movement brought about all of that, but it didn't change some of those housing conditions and the structural issues that cause homelessness. And again, these things are still apparent in communities today. We still see redlining. We see the unequal unequal appraisals of housing in the home ownership market. We see blighted neighborhoods without resources. And we see people discriminating against people because of their source of income and their source of subsidy. So you can't discriminate against people because of their race, but you certainly can say you're not able to accept Section 8 certificates. So again, that those practices are prevalent today, even though we talk about them all the time. So we know that we haven't gone very far from where we were. The dates have changed, some of the practices have changed, but the policies have left a lasting impact on communities of color. And people will make the argument that, this was a very long time ago, especially if we start with 1619, or even if we go further back to the first colonizers that came to America. But if you look at a timeline, it's a relatively short period that we've been in what we think of as positive atmosphere when it comes to these issues. So we mark as positive 1954 because of Brown versus Board of Education. But if you think about that really short period of time until today, it wasn't very long ago, and we haven't been in the right direction for a very long time compared to the 400 years of slavery, and even farther back, the theft of land from Native Americans and all of the things in between, the unequal treatment of people coming from other countries. It's been a very, very short time. So I'm going to stop there. I think at this point, we are going to just really quickly, I think, Sarah, we want to take a break here, or do we want to take a break on the next slide?
Yeah, we could, maybe now's a good time to break, and then we can go. This is more about sort of policy. So we'll move these over and we'll take a break here. You're right, Donald.
The intermission's just a few slides ahead.
Okay, well, we'll go through these really quickly. Sure. Why don't we just finish those two slides? And the first slide really talked about the disproportionality that we see nationally. African Americans are represented at a 3-to-1 rate. Their representation in general population versus their representation in homelessness, it's about a 3-to-1 rate. Native Americans, it's about 8-to-1. They represent 1%. They represent 8-to-1 is their representation in general population versus their representation in the homeless population. We still have to work on how we do a better job of counting Latinos, because of course, Latino is not a race, it's an ethnicity. And so those numbers are skewed. So we don't have the best picture of what that looks like, that disproportionality. We can see it in family homelessness and youth homelessness. We see those numbers in many communities. There's an overrepresentation, but we haven't really done a good job of quantifying those numbers because of how the census is tracked and because of how HUD tracks numbers. The next slide is just California. And again, we see quite a bit of disproportionality in California. And if we look at the three bars, the lightest bar is the general population. The middle bar is those living in poverty, and the bottom is those who are experiencing homelessness. And you see disproportionality in many different places. One thing that I'll point out is that the poverty numbers for most races go down. So if you see a poverty number, and this is a national statistic as well, so 8% of African Americans are in poverty, are living below the poverty line, but 30% are homeless. So 30% of the population is homeless. But if you look at other racial categories, so for white people, 54% live in poverty, but 53% are homeless. For Hispanic and Latinx individuals, 51% in poverty, 32% in homelessness. So the numbers of people of color, especially Black people and Native Americans, because you'll see that there's a smaller population of American Indian and Alaskan Natives. If you look at poverty, poverty isn't the issue, because with most people, poverty goes down. But when you look at those two groups of people, it goes up. So we know that it's not just poverty in that case. And that's why we really stress how much and how important racism is in this equation. And we'll talk a little bit more about all of that later. We want to ask you a question when we come back, but right now we want you to go to intermission, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks, Donald. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all for joining with us. We are going to take a 5-minute break. So we'll break from 11:55 Pacific to noon. So you have 5 minutes. We'll be right back.
Donald,
Yes.
do you see when I have the chat open, do you see the chat?
I did not see the
No, no,
chat.
you're not seeing, all you're seeing is intermission.
Yeah, I'm just seeing intermission.
Okay.
There's not much in the chat, is it?
No, chat's been quiet. You've not missed anything. Just had
Okay.
themselves.
So I thought we were behind. I sped up a little bit.
Nope, you are 20 minutes ahead.
Ah,
That's good. It'll actually give us time to maybe have a little more interaction.
yeah, I was really pushing because I do spend more time on the post reconstruction stuff. But hey, I looked at your message and I just glanced at it and I said, "Oh boy, I'm behind. I should catch up."
I misread it too.
We're ahead. When I say up, I mean ahead. Sorry.
No, that's all good.
I'm still doing 5 things at once.
No, it's all good. We'll get back.
How long is the workshop?
Jen, we have it set for 2 hours. We're about 20 minutes ahead of schedule, so it probably won't go for the full 2 hours today.
Okay, all right, thank you.
But it may, if we get chatty.
Thank you. I just have to be somewhere by 4, so as
Gotcha.
long as.
Gotcha. No problem. We're also recording and sending it. We'll send it to all participants afterwards. So
Yes, that's wonderful. My agency was asking me about
Oh.
that.
I should have stopped the recording. Go ahead.
And Chris, thank you for your reflection. And so we'd love to just pick your brains and hear any thoughts about what you learned today, any reactions to any of the data we shared or background on the data. And if you could, we'd love to see some of your faces as you share. So please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jen Aragon. I work in homeless services. I'm a housing navigator. And even though the laws have changed, like now they can't discriminate where the money comes from, race, but they do. They just use a different reason. So I see it. I also noticed in the slides there were nothing about schools.
We'll touch on that a little bit.
Okay.
You've seen the rest of our slides, haven't you? No,
No,
but we
not
will.
yet,
We will. No, we will
I-
touch on school.
I lived in the Tenderloin as a teenager, and just the difference in schools, the supplies, the desks, the everything is just extremely different in equality.
You know, there's some really good readings on kind of equality economically as well. One I would suggest is Isabel Wilkerson, excuse me. She wrote a book called Caste. So if you get a chance to read that, it really talks about racism, but it also talks about how it's really very similar to the caste system in other societies. And so one of the things she points out is how schools are actually funded, and they're based on the wealth of a community, and how really that starts people off with an unlevel playing field. And so, Sarah, it looks like you were going to say something as well.
No, I don't know. No, I'd love to hear from our participants.
Can you say the last name of that woman that wrote the book Caste? Isabella
Wilkerson.
Wilkerson.
She also wrote another book, and I'm going to mess this one up, but Voices of the Native Son, I think it is. That may not be it, but it's really good. I'll get it for you. So other comments? Anyone else? Darnisha, I'm not picking on you, but I see that you came on camera, so I thought you might have something to share as well.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for picking on me. I could relate to pretty much everything you have put up there as far as the slides go in the history. My family is originally from Tennessee. My great grandma's Cherokee Indian, so that part of our heritage and all the pain and devastation to that. My grandfather was a sharecropper. My parents picked cotton every morning before they went to school. My dad migrated us to Ohio. So when you're talking about the Midwest, I integrated a Catholic school from first grade through 8th grade. And when I went to high school, which was another Catholic school, I was one of 3 Blacks on campus. And my career took me into corporate America, and I'm usually the only Black person in the room. So
Yes.
I can relate to all those things because all those things are very prevalent in my history and my family. And I just actually signed up for ancestry.com to do a DNA to figure out a lot of things that I'm curious about with my family and my history and my culture from the past. So I resonated with pretty much everything you're sharing today. I came from government to the Regional Task Force on Homelessness, and I saw the disparities there, working with economic development and trying to work with our underserved communities to make sure they had a seat at the table and not weren't the menu on the table, so to speak, and the menu is to keep them out, right? So in this position, I work with the community heavily, the same underserved population, including the LGBTQIA community, and to make sure they're represented and have a voice, and that we listen to their voice. Like, we want to help people, but sometimes we want to give them the help that we feel they need and how we should give it to them instead of ask the question, what do you need and how can we help you? So I'm still working that out in a lot of ways in the community and with those who have the keys to that service. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing a lot of really important points you made. I got really frustrated. This may not be the most important of the things you said, but I know with doing the ancestry searches, I got really, really frustrated because it kind of stopped. So if you go back far enough, there is no history. Sarah alluded to this. History just was not recorded during that period. And, people weren't even assigned names in the census. They were assigned, whatever they looked like and whatever they did, but they weren't even kind enough to provide people with names, even though they were counting people. So yeah, that was a very frustrating journey for me, but certainly it's worth doing as far back as you can get.
Thank you.
Other thoughts? Anyone else? We'd love to hear some other voices. We've heard some really powerful stuff here. And again, we want you to be engaged and we won't, there's no judge. This is a judgment-free zone. So we want to hear, whatever your thoughts are, even if they're contrary to some of what we shared. We'd love to hear that as well. That's how we learn. So if you have anything you want to share, we'd love to hear it. Kirsten, I'm sorry.
That's okay. One of the things that I thought about while the slides were going by, sort of like Sarah mentioned, there's that picture of what we were raised with, that this was a collaborative thing between the colonists and the tribal members. And then as I aged and I started to see racism, and I had to start formulating my own thoughts on it, right? Because there was nothing to teach me, but I knew in my gut what was right and what was wrong. It's just, my overall thought was, and then I remember at one point seeing a movie on the racism in Australia with the Aboriginal and thinking, wow, we don't have that history here. So while I had made a shift mentally there were certain things that were still ingrained in me and from my childhood that I didn't realize were still happening, right? That it wasn't this happy story that I'd been taught when I was a child. There was racism that I saw that I knew was wrong, but there is still so much more to learn, right? And so that's what I was thinking about as I was watching your slideshow, is that, here's where I started and here's where I'm at. And I can't say where I'm at is the end of my journey in this learning about racism. And so I look forward to interacting in opportunities like this, right? So that I can grow and be part of the solution, not part of the problem. That was my only comment.
No, that's a great comment, and thank you very much for sharing that. It's very powerful what you shared. And I see our other Christian has her hand up as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to share is that I did not grow up in California. I grew up in the Rockies, in the Denver metro area. And through all of the years of study, we weren't that far from California. The only thing we learned in history about California was the gold rush. We didn't learn any of the history of Spain, any of the history of Mexico. You would think that colonial history had only to do with the East Coast. And so it's only been in my adult life that I have come to learn more about that. And I find it even more compelling because my mom's family is Spanish and there were explorers in our family. And so it's been an interesting thing to have to kind of grapple with, it's extremely likely that they weren't doing things that today I would certainly consider to be on the up and up. But every time I have the opportunity to attend one of these sessions, I just leave feeling more empowered about cycles being broken. And I think that that's a really important piece. So just really want to express my gratitude for these sessions. Every time I sit in, I'm so grateful. Thank you.
And we thank you, and thank you for your participation and your continued participation, because this is new stuff, and it's also, we like to think of this as building muscle, because if you want to get better at something, you have to continue to practice it. You don't run a marathon and stop. You got to keep working out, so that you have the muscle to be able to finish at the end. And so we're hoping that people will not use this won't be a one-off for people, so that you'll dig a little deeper. I learn something myself every day. I'm immersed in this all the time. I remember I was always always had this feeling of shame about my ancestors, because I never read anything about rebellion. And I thought that people basically just were so docile that they just allow themselves to be subjected to all the violence. And then I learned that there were tons of rebellions. But what happened every time there was a rebellion, the punishment was more brutal. So it was so brutal that people started to lose the desire to endure that. But there were people that escaped and lived in the woods and lived in the mountains. So, that is something that I've learned over time that really gave me a different understanding as well. So no matter who you are, no matter how much you do this, you'll learn more every day. And I just wish we did a little bit more of that in our formal education. Because even on the positive side, like most people, what you learn about the civil rights movement, you may hear about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. And that's probably the extent of what you learn. But when you sit with scholars and you talk about, how many people were involved and how very, very well organized that movement was, it's incredible to learn. So just wanted to share a couple of my reflections when we do this. But if anybody else wants to share, we can take maybe one more and then we'll move on. All right, not hearing any, we'll turn it back over to Sarah.
I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work. I think
Looks good, Sarah.
Looks good.
Thank you for affirming that. And I will reflect, thank you for all those comments that I know that I am continually learning. I'm in a constant state of learning around our history. And I think that we are all still collectively both unlearning and uncovering history that's been buried for a really long time. So it's a lifelong process. So we talked about the history, and now we're going to talk about what this looks like across a few sectors in terms of policy and organizational structures. And what we see is that regardless of where you land, regardless of what sector you're talking about, you're always going to see the same disparities. You're going to see the same bad outcomes. This legacy of racial injustice runs throughout. It is inescapable. And to the point around education, we're going to start by talking a little bit about education. Education, of course, is so core. This is some data from public schools, national data. So it says that African-American children are 16% of students at 25% of suspensions, 18% of preschool students at 48% of suspensions, which by the way is insane that we're suspending kids who are in preschool. Let's put a little pin in that. And that suspended students are 3 times more likely to drop out of school, which is of course sort of the beginning of what we're calling the school to prison pipeline. There are a lot of factors at play in these high suspension rates, but one of them is implicit bias, which we're going to talk about in a future training. But these are the unconscious biases that we all carry that inform our everyday decisions and interactions with others. So this implicit bias, or this is the culture, this is the culture that we live and breathe every day. It tells us that Black kids and other kids of color are, quote, more dangerous and that they, quote, can't control their behavior, while white kids are generally seen as good. So if a white kid acts out, they're seen as having a bad day or just being rambunctious. But that same behavior in a Black kid is seen as indicative of a serious problem. As a consequence, Black kids will get hauled off to the principal and suspended, and white kids will get a talking to or perhaps an in-class timeout. That's what we're seeing here. So we've got another one on suspension and expulsion. Same story here, but I'm going to talk a little bit about structural racism here. So we see here that you can see that compared to white girls, kids of color are more likely to be suspended. Girls of color are more likely to be suspended and expelled. And one of the things that's happening here is that we have systematically defunded school counselors across our schools. And we've chosen instead to pay for school police. That was a choice that we made in our policy decisions. Of course, it's also important to note in terms of laws, many states have instituted disturbing schools laws, which came out of desegregation efforts, and that give wide discrepancy to police to arrest kids for behavior that they called, it's very broad, it's very ill-defined, it's disturbing the school. So as a result, adolescent behavior that might once have led to a counseling session or perhaps even been preempted by good social emotional learning activities are now in the hands of police. And by the way, I don't even know if I have to say this, that you still don't see cops in predominantly white schools, right? So we are only policing schools that are predominantly have kids of color. You add in the fact with the implicit bias I talked about before, in which kids of color are seen as naturally more dangerous, and then you see the suspension and expulsion. Stats, and you all might remember the case of the teenage girl in South Carolina who was really viciously dragged from her desk, banged on the floor and handcuffed and arrested for what the teacher said was not turning over her cell phone. Both she and the girl, and she was really just sitting there, both she and her friend who filmed it were both of them were arrested. They both dropped out of school. They ultimately got their GEDs. But it was a horrifying incident for them. High school graduation rates, again, we see lower rates, the higher rates for your Asian American, Pacific Islander and white people, and lower rates for Hispanic, Black, and Native peoples. It's important to note that schools can be really unfriendly places for kids of color. So we talked about having police in schools. You enter a school, you frequently have to go through a magnetometer. You might have to get searched. You might have to empty your bag out. There's a denial of students' culture. So from clothing to hair, to this day, Black kids are suspended for wearing locks. Native kids are still getting their braids cut off out west. School can be really traumatizing places for students. They are not necessarily safe places for them. And so this is a high school graduation. So you might say, well, kids can get their GEDs, but a GED is not necessarily equivalent to a diploma from an accredited high school. Both can get you entry-level positions, but frequently employers will look at a high school diploma as a pathway to an upper-level management position that a student, employee with a GED might not be eligible for. And lastly, I'll turn to incarceration before I turn it over to Donald. I think personally, this is my background, of course. I think in a lot of ways, this is where racism, where the rubber hits the road, because this is where we can really deprive people of their liberties. So here we can see in terms of incarceration rates that Black people are almost 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white people. So what's driving this? We know that the genesis of the whole justice system was the 13th Amendment, right? That said that you can't be enslaved except for people who've committed a crime. So in the Sentencing Commission, they issued a report in 2017 in which Black men received 20% longer sentences in federal system than white men for the exact same crime. So that's held true even when you're controlling for gun possession, you're controlling for age, you're controlling for prior criminal history, that Black men still will get 20% longer sentence. So we say, what's driving this? There's a lot that's driving it. I recommend that folks, there's a bunch of great books that you can read about this, and we'll include them in our resource packet. The New Jim Crow is by Michelle Alexander, is sort of the classic one that folks turn to now, but there's some other ones by Mark Maurer, Race to Incarcerate. One thing that happens is policing, which neighborhoods get policed. Black neighborhoods, neighborhoods of color get policed far more often than white neighborhoods. We actually didn't even used to have police forces until we had the need to create slave patrols. So police forces came out of the need to surveil and control the movements of Black people. Drug policies are another thing that drives this higher incarceration rate. So we've incredibly disparate drug policies. So if you look at crack cocaine sentencing disparity, in 1986, there was a law that was passed, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. That had 100-to-1 disparity, sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. So powder cocaine, Black and white people use drugs at the same level, but white people are using powder cocaine, Black people predominantly using crack cocaine, and there was 100-to-1 sentencing disparity. This was recently amended in 2010. We had a great sentencing act and amended it to 18-to-1. There's still a disparity in the sentencing around those. We'll include a bunch more books to read. There's lots to read about this, but I'm going to toss it over to Donald to talk about home ownership.
Thanks, Sarah. So again, we've covered a number of areas here, and sometimes when you look at some of those statistics, people can kind of write them off as a factor of behavior. So, you know, people are more criminal if they're people of color. But if you look at what's beneath those statistics and the context that comes with them, it really paints a very different picture of the criminal justice system. And that exists both for people experiencing homelessness. And I just want to add this one point to the criminalization issue. So 72% of the cities in this country criminalize the practice of homelessness. But one thing that we found in California is that when people are arrested for quality of life crimes, there's a 6-to-1 ratio of people of color being arrested versus non-people of color. And so we are seeing even a disproportionality when it comes to the criminalization of homelessness. And then if we look at the other extreme, which is the death sentence, people who get the death sentence are more likely to get that if it's a Black person who kills a white person versus a Black person that kills a Black person or a white person that kills a Black person. So at every level of criminal justice, we see these disparities that are really shattering. And so home ownership. And the reason why we talk about home ownership, again, we'll go back to redlining, but one of the ways that is most effective in creating wealth in this country is home ownership. And so the denial of home ownership for generations really has impacted the wealth disparities that we see in this country. So when we look at home ownership, African Americans are at the very bottom, followed by Hispanics and also other races and multiple races. So those categories are at the very bottom of the ladder when it comes to home ownership, with Blacks being the lowest, far below the US average. And that is still today. We've seen images of multiracial couples getting their houses appraised and having hundreds of thousands of dollars of difference when, so there's one video that's really provocative, really like tugs at your heart, where a Black and white couple, a mixed couple, got their house appraised. The Black woman got it appraised. They had all of the things in their house, their pictures, their mementos, all kinds of things that were could be associated with her heritage and her present day being. And they got it appraised, and they took all of that stuff out. The pictures of her, the pictures of her family, the statues, all the things that would be associated with a person of color. And the white male, her husband, he got the house appraised. There was a $160,000 difference in the appraisal. So again, we talk about these things in terms of our history, but there are present as well. So we'll go to the next one. So again, the wealth gap, really pronounced. You see at the bottom of the economic ladder that Blacks and Hispanics, when it comes to the wealth gap, it's a really pronounced difference. And you see that it stays low with those populations, even at times when we have recessions and the recession raises, but the wealth gap doesn't. The wealth gap stays the same. Actually, it's more pronounced during the recession, if you will. So the disparities in wealth in this country. And again, we saw there's a video called The Amazing Race, and it looks at how, people have basically been lapsed while they were standing still and not able to generate wealth through home ownership or other vehicles. White people were able to continue to generate wealth generation after generation and then pass that wealth down. So what you have in Black and Hispanic and other minority and marginalized communities is there's no one passing wealth on to them. So they have to start from zero to create the wealth. And so the gap continues to grow within those populations. The next slide.
I just wanted to point out something I said in the chat that I think you'll find interesting. So I live in what's known as Harlem of the West. So 5 Points, Denver, a historic Black community. We actually, the Juneteenth festival that just occurred, I got to meet the homeowners that used to own my home. They lived here for 2 generations, and we look back to the tax records and they paid about $30,000 for this house, and they owned it almost 50 years. They lost the house in the 2000s before the big housing crisis, but they still lost it. And there's no way that's not a result of racist policies at the bank, at the city. And it was heartbreaking because we met this family, we've been receiving their mail. We know their names, they're a wonderful family. They said, we really like to have this house. And I said in my head, this house is $750,000 right now. It's not 30,000. This community has gentrified you out of this space and allowed me to come into it. That is heartbreaking. I hate it.
Absolutely.
And there was nothing I could say to the Parker family to make that any better. The policies that created this situation are still here. They're still forcing folks that want to live in this historic community out of it.
Absolutely. And so that actually goes back to the idea that many of those houses, even if people were able to gain houses, they were not able to insure them. And so they were very easily acquired by other people. And then we also see a migration to the center city. And so people are gentrifying some of those communities that people have kept up for years. They're buying those properties, raising the property rates, the taxes, in those communities, and they become unaffordable for some of the inhabitants that already live there. The other part of that, and somebody put this in the chat, the lack of equality when it comes to appraisals. So their houses are worth such small numbers that they're very easily acquired. So all of it works together to create the inequalities that we see today. The wealth gap and the home ownership gap are a direct result of those policies in the 30s and before. And so here's a couple of others that I think are really, really, definitely Chris put in, to be clear, I cannot afford my house now, because housing prices, and we could get deeper into structural issues around homelessness, just the incredible rise in housing prices. And now we're starting to see that in the rental market has a lot to do with the numbers of people that we see homeless. And I don't want to take a side here or start any controversy, but we've just seen the Supreme Court strike down the ability to get an abortion. And it has really, really dramatic effects on women of color, because there are disparities that are unimaginable when it comes to pregnancy. So Black women died 3 times more often giving birth than white women in this country. So out of every 10,000 live births, 41 Black women die and 13 white women die. So we know that at times the decision, whether you like it or not, is a life or death situation. And now we have people put in a situation where they aren't allowed to make that decision on their own. And that's going to negatively impact both people of color and people who are in impoverished situations. So no matter how you think about that decision, there's a direct relationship to people that we work with in marginalized communities. And here's another statistic, the next one. To me, this really underscores, and I want people to grasp what we're saying here. These are infant mortality rates by race in the United States. And you see that, again, infant mortality rates, Black women are at the highest level there. But the next slide is what really, from the March of Dimes, is what really underscores something else going on besides the health and even income of a person that makes for those rates to be very different. So you see here, Black women and white women. So the average for a Black woman with an 8th grade or less education is 9.5%, the infant mortality rate. For white women with an 8th grade education, it's 5.9%. But then if you move down and you look at advanced degrees, which should offer you more income, should offer you probably better health care, the percentage for Black women with advanced degrees is relatively the same as the percentage with for white women with a 8th grade or less education. So that is really, really incredibly revealing, that regardless of your education or your health, your ability to access healthcare, infant mortality rates are the same. And so that takes away the excuse of education or wealth or healthcare. There's something else happening in our system that we have to find out about. So I think of all the statistics, that's one of the most revealing to me. So next slide. So we're gonna take some more time to do some reflection with you. There's a lot of other data we could have poured out, especially about the homeless population. I don't know if you recognize the disparities in California when it comes to race are even more pronounced than the national average when it comes to homelessness. But what of those other sectors would people like to talk about? I saw a bunch in the chat. Chris's comment was really a very profound comment, but love to hear from other people. So we're going to open it up again. I'm going to give it to Sarah to lead this discussion. So we'd love to hear from others about the other sectors in the population. Darnisha? I'm sorry, Sarah, you're leading this discussion.
No, please, let's do it together, Donald. It's all good. I didn't see Darnisha's hand up, so that's all good.
Thank you for calling on me. I want to speak to the medical piece on not so much for children's birth because I'm past that age. My son's an adult and I'm a grandma. But I want to speak to it from having good health care. Personally, I have Kaiser. I've had a very bad allergic reaction to the Moderna shots, the second and the booster. And since September of last year, I've been dealing with it, and actually I have a 3 o'clock today with my primary care doctor to share my experience as it relates to the information that you just shared with us about the level of service in the medical industry as it relates to people of color. That's where this is coming from. So I went to a dermatologist because it's giving me the skin rash. And the first dermatologist wasn't really sure, but he did try to treat it. The second dermatologist says that, and this is all within the Kaiser network, says that, it's just allergies. There's not really anything wrong with you. He really tried to be very dismissive of me. And I had to push hard back at him to acknowledge that there is a problem and there needs to be some type of research or testing to figure out and identify what the problem is, and then what course of action. And he still pushed back. And then I emailed another doctor and he saw that. Then he was like, okay, well, we'll do a sampling of these tests. And I'm like, no, we need the whole gamut of those tests. And there were allergies, right? Because I would drink something one day and I wouldn't have an reaction, but I drink it the next day, then I break out in all these hives. So in the process of doing that test, which they did 81 pricks on my back, and I had to wait to see if my body responded to it. My body did not respond to the test, but the allergies and the hives popped out on my thighs, but they're working on my back. And without me, I honestly believe without me physically being still in the hospital for the nurse to witness that, he was still going to dismiss me as there was nothing wrong with me. And then after it was witnessed, then he says, well, yeah, there's several people who are having this allergic reaction to the Moderna vaccine. Now you want to validate me because you saw it. It wasn't enough that I'm telling you I have this problem, and you just wanted to dismiss me even though I have good health care. So even with that, in a person of color, you still have to fight to get the services that you need and that you are entitled to. So that's how I could relate to those numbers and what you were saying in relationship to the medical industry. And I just wanted to share that.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
It's very similar in the homeless community as well. They're not heard. And also with the row versus the change in row. It's until there's services for after birth. It's all about control of women. So, I won't get started on that. But what I did want to say is when you talked about the schools and the Black kids getting suspended and in trouble for their anger, we're teaching kids, we're not teaching them how to manage their anger. We're teaching them to bottle it up or you're going to be arrested.
Mm-hmm.
And so true. And I think also that frequently teachers might perceive Black kids as being angry when they're not, right? It's perceived as angry and it's responded to in such a way. So what you said is true, that we don't do enough social emotional learning. There aren't enough counselors. And there are a lot of studies that Black kids and Black adults are just seen as more dangerous.
And I see it in like foster care, which is in poor communities, and kids are just put on drugs. I mean, and maybe they're not angry, but I work with a lot of kids that are angry and they have good reason to be angry. You know, they've had really lots of trauma and craziness in their life. And they're just drugged on medication instead of learning how to deal with their anger. Or like in, you know, situations where there's more color kids in these, kids of color in these poor communities, they're seen to be angry, and we need to control them rather than teach them how to work within themselves.
Well, and I would just add that we're going to do another workshop on the effects of internalized racism. And internalized racism, some of the manifestations of that are violence. There's also mental and substance abuse issues that are related to people's the constant drumbeat of racism. So it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. And so some of the acting out is a result of trauma that's been induced by ongoing racism. And that's kind of groundbreaking study, that it does have the same after effects of other kinds of trauma, but it's not recognized as that. And so many times kids are judged for their trauma, for their behavior, when it's really them experiencing trauma and manifesting it in violent behavior sometimes, and sometimes other kind of mental health issues. So it's really, really interesting, a topic that we have not discussed at all, but it also can be other things that are happening at home. We know that. A couple of other things that parents kind of avoid is going to shelter, because an inordinate amount of kids of color are taken out of the home, which is illegal, because they use children's protective services, or they're deemed to be unfit parents because they're deemed to not be able to take care of their children. It's illegal to do that, but it happens all the time. You know, and there hasn't been a lot of discussion about this, but you know, the other thing to me, although there's this police force that's in our schools now, I do think that there's a difference in care even from those law enforcement agencies. And I can't escape Uvalde and the fact that there was not a adequate response to those children from law enforcement. And had that been other children, would there have been a quicker response? Were their lives valued enough in that situation? These were brown children, and our response, even though the responders were brown men for the most part as well, they did not respond in an adequate way. And we'll learn more about that. But I think that's another place where, you know, there's that intersection of law enforcement and what its role is within a community of Black and brown people, that was very different, because that didn't happen in some of the other school events that we saw. There were people, you know, that rushed into the fire, if you will. So that's another, to me, indication that, you know, people are still being treated very differently in this country, in many, many different situations.
And it happens in like Native girls. It's very common for young Native girls to go missing, and there isn't there. I mean, if when a white girl is missing, it's like they send out the Amber Alerts, and there's, you know, on the news. But there's so many Native girls that are missing, and it just does not get enough attention.
And we're starting to discover like some of the atrocities there in those schools. I mean, a lot of it's coming out of Canada, but we're starting to see glimpses of people talking about the same kind of treatment here in the United States. So the history is long, it's very painful, and it's important that we continue to talk about it, all these different issues that collide. So love to hear from other people. We don't want to just hear from us. We'd love to hear from some of you. I know it's tough to talk about this, but it really, you know, starts to heal when you can actually verbalize what you see every day. So again, love to hear from other people.
One of the things that I noticed recently, or not, maybe not recently, but I've noticed more often that when I see police brutality against people of color, that they're not always white.
No.
And that bothers me. And I don't understand it. I'm very confused by it. So are we going to talk about how that comes about at all?
Yeah, and we'll talk about it in some of our workshops. So there's a couple of things that could be factors there. One is assimilation. So sometimes people are put into situations that they start to exhibit the same behaviors as the people who they are socialized by. And so you see that many different ways. I'll give you Clarence Thomas, for instance. Clarence Thomas is an African-American man. Would you say that the decisions that he's made during his career have been beneficial to people of color? I would say probably not. So that is one example. The other thing that happens is there's a lot of discrimination within races. And we will talk a little bit about colorism. Colorism at times is a very as harmful as some of the other forms of racism when it happens in communities. We know we'll talk more about that. I don't want to kind of give away that workshop, but that is something that's very and when we talk about internalized racism, there's two kinds of internalized. There's internalized superiority and internalized inferiority. So people being oppressed and marginalized for long enough will start to believe that's how they should be treated. And so a person put in a position of authority may have internalized the fact that these people of color are dangerous, or people that I should treat differently, or that they're throwaway, or that they're a different class. So yeah, that is all of those are factors. And Sarah, I'm sure you have more.
Well, I was just going to add that sometimes if you're operating within a racist structure, you may have limited options. And so if we look at the officer who killed George Floyd, who had been known to have been, had been having racist actions and had a long history of complaints against him, and yet was in charge of the training of the officers under his watch on that day. He had a lot of power over those officers, right? So they could, if they got a bad rating from that officer who, Chauvin, if they got a bad rating from that could mean the difference between them advancing in their career or not advancing in their career. It could be so you're operating within these racist institutions. It can be not impossible. It can be very difficult though to break out and find a path to chart your own course and not carry that banner.
And history has a lot of examples of how even in slavery, there were people of color that were, the overseers. This is probably a dramatic form, and I won't recommend it to everybody on the call, but the Django Unchained is kind of the example of that. That really shows you how people will assimilate to protect themselves. And when we talk about structural racism and institutional racism, it's not all white people that are part of those institutions or structures. It is all kinds of people. And so we know that people can be socialized very quickly, very easily, and will be a part of the oppressive nature of those structures and institutions. Darnisha, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I have a question. Are we in the future, this body here, will you be talking about today's racism? It's much more subtle, right? Especially when you're in corporate America and you're at higher level positions, right, with your peers. The road for a Black female, and I'll talk about myself, to get to the level of success that I've had working in corporate America, working for the mayor that runs the 8th largest nation, working for the police department, and now in the nonprofit space. Those were those are fights all the way up the hill to get there. And then there's a fight to be in the room and to be respected that, you know, I'm just as qualified to be in the room as you are qualified to be in the room, right? And then there's the, we'll welcome you, but you need to be like us. You need to project like us. You need to talk like us. You need to look like us. So all those things, you know, you have to deal with on a daily basis and still do your job, and the impact of that. And if you question, you challenge, then you're perceived to be intimidating, or you're perceived to be aggressive, right? But I can ask the same question 50 million ways and still not get an answer. So because I keep asking it 50 million ways, now I'm aggressive. So I don't know if your courses kind of talk about that.
We are. We're going to talk about the institutional and the interpersonal racism and bias, and you know how that permeates within the workspace. You know, and as pronounced as it is in Fortune 500 companies, it's even more pronounced, I think, in the nonprofit sector. So what you typically see is a layer of people of color at the ground level. So you have your intake workers and you know your shelter monitors and people like that. But when you get up to the corporate level, the C-suite, you start to see a filtering out of people of color. Most of the directorship in the history has been white women, and not even men in that particular case. But we will talk about that because it's very common. It is, we all have bias, which we'll talk about, but sometimes whether through unconscious or conscious bias, we actually will prevent people from being able to get those opportunities. So we'll talk a lot about that. That's there's a lot of information about that, and there's really some remedies to that that some communities, some organizations are trying, but definitely not to the level that we need them. But we will definitely touch on those issues quite a bit. So we talk down all the levels of racism. And Chris, I know it's about time for us to get to you, but I think
we're okay.
Jen had a question too.
Yeah, we're fine. Jen can go. We have 5 minutes. We're good.
I just have a quick comment about assimilation. I'm first generation born here on my dad's side. And when my father came to this country, he didn't speak English. So when he went to school, he was shamed, punished. His family was fined for speaking any dialect of Spanish. And so he was really taught to shame his culture, and he never taught his children his first language. He actually even changed his name for it to become more American. And so that was just my comment about assimilating, being taught to, I guess.
Yeah, it's part of the socialization process. We very quickly do that at times. That is, you know, when we talk about colorism, when you look at it, it's very pronounced in Latin American and Central American communities in a way that probably is more profound than here in America. Although, you know, Ketanji Brown, one of the things that I think is remarkable about her is that she is a person of color who's dark skinned, because most of the people that have been accepted have been people of mixed race. So a dark-skinned woman, a Black woman with braids, is not the picture you see when you see people at the highest level. So even though there's been a lot of progress, there's still some barriers based on your hair type or your skin color. There's a glass ceiling that we haven't really penetrated very much. And the same thing for darker skinned Hispanic individuals. So there is still a lot of glass ceiling that we have to break through. But thank you for that comment. Many people do that. They come to America. Well, we're going to show you some videos that will really, really help you kind of personify how that's happening on a regular basis in this country with conversations from people from different races.
Thanks, Donald, for that. I just wanted to respond to what Darnisha said. It's disheartening to me that the behaviors that she mentioned are the same things that as a white man I'm rewarded for. And there is no, that's not just racism, that's also sexism, and that's paternalism, and that's all sorts of things wrapped up in intersectionalities that we bring to this work. It's just, I can do this training 1,000 times, and I've done it a lot, not 1,000, but a lot, and still have things that when I come out of it, I'm like, man, why can't things just not be like that? So I just wanted to reflect that to you, Darnisha, that I hear you, I see you, and I wish it were that way. Sarah, Donald, do you have any parting thoughts before we end the session?
I don't. And I just want to, can I just make one really quick comment? A person in the chat says, it is tiring being a person of color. I think it can be, but I think that we should wear our skin with as much pride as absolutely possible. We do get those, I call them pinpricks. You're going to experience it on a daily basis, but it's so important that we transcend that and we don't let those things define us. And so that's what I try to do myself. And I would encourage other people to not let those pinpricks hold you down. Just keep fighting for as much as you can get in this lifetime. And it may be tiring, but we still got to get to the finish line. So just keep pushing through.
Thanks, Donald. That was super inspiring.
Yes. Thank you, Donald. Thank you, Sarah, for presenting today. Thank you for everyone who participated. Thank you, Kristen, for keeping things going on the technical side. I do want to just kind of reflect what Donald said. These can be heavy conversations and should be heavy conversations. Take some grace, take some space to reflect, to heal, to think. I know I do. And we really want to see you again as well. So thank you for attending this California Housing Community Development Community Workshop offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services contract. Look out for more information on our next racial equity session series. In the chat, Kirsten put our training website. I put specifically a training on colorism on July 15th. We want to see you all there if you can. At the end of this session, when we hit stop, you're going to see a 3-question survey. Please fill that out. We read them. We want to know if we're hitting the right tones, if we're covering the right topics. So it won't take much of your time, but please do those that survey when it pops up. Thank you for being with us and building community today. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day.
Hey, Donald, do you have 2 seconds?
I do.